Well, in our gospel reading, we have the story of Jesus sending the 72. Sending. The Latin term there is mitto, from which we get mission and missionary. We actually get the word mass from it too, because when we are finished the mass, we are sent out. And so Jesus is making missionary disciples. Out of his disciples, they are to experience a lot of things. They are to experience the agony and the ecstasy of being a missionary disciple. When I was a teenager, our youth pastor decided that we all needed a real different kind of experience to shake us up. So he planned a trip to the Rocky Mountains. And the tour guides took us all the way up above timberline. We were in places that we only saw in National Geographic. I mean, he took us up to this cliff and you looked down, you couldn't even see the bottom of the caverns. And it was then that I knew the worth of my youth pastor, because he was afraid of heights. He didn't tell us that. And he looked and he stuck his head in a crack and he said, "I can't do this." He had a total meltdown and everybody sort of passed him by, encouraging him with scripture words. I can do all things with Christ that strengthens me. But you see, he was a true missionary disciple. He got out of his comfort zone because he knew that's what we needed. Be missionary disciples. We were made for hard things, every one of us. Be a missionary disciple. What can you expect? Well, Jesus tells us of two difficult realities. Number one, it's a huge job. There's a plentiful harvest, but there are very few laborers. There's very few missionary disciples. So what does Jesus have us do? Pray. That's it, pray. Because we cannot pray for harvesters without becoming one yourself. It starts with prayer. Prayer unites our hearts with God, and his concerns become our concerns. Prayer leads us down the path to becoming missionary disciples. On a good Sunday, our church here has 2,000 people. But there are 9,000 in our parish that should be here. They are Catholics. They should be here. How do we get them there? Jesus is asking us to pray for them. And once you start praying for them, then something happens in our own hearts and we become missionary disciples. But it can be dangerous. What does Jesus say? I send you out as lambs amidst the wolves. All cultures are and have always been hostile to true missionary disciples. If we are progressing along the road to becoming missionary disciples, it may dawn on us that we might be persecuted, or we might lose our jobs, or maybe even lose faith among people. Yes, even our own lives. In other words, we'll probably be treated like Jesus. People do not like to be disturbed with the truth, especially when it is lived out by a missionary disciple. We swim in unfriendly waters, dear brothers and sisters. Be a missionary disciple. It'll mess up your life for the better. Well, so Jesus tells us what we can expect. Now he tells us this: be missionary disciples, change your manners. Aren't you glad for manners? Why do we have manners in our society? Well, it's so that we don't offend other peoples, and that's a good thing. It's great to have manners so we can get along with one another, right? But what does Jesus tell us here in verse 4? He says, rock the boat. Rock the boat. Travel light with no self-provisions. And if someone comes along greeting you, he says, don't even greet you. I mean, that's bad manners, don't you think? What's he saying? He says, we're not about polite small talk. There's an urgency about being a missionary disciple. Are we urgent? In verses 5 and 8, we see that the missionary disciple is dependent on the goodwill of believers. This does not encourage independence and self-sufficiency that we so much value in our culture. Verses 9 through 12. If we are rejected, we're to wipe the dust off our clothing. This is symbolic of them rejecting God, so God rejects them. Can we look at people and say, your soul is in peril? That's bad manners, isn't it? There's a great example. Back in the 18th century America, there was a great evangelist named George Whitefield. You may have heard of him. I mean, he was like a rock star back then. When he came to a big town like Philadelphia, the whole town would just come out just to hear George Whitefield preach. Benjamin Franklin actually paced it off, and he said he could hear Whitefield clearly at a mile away. Anyways, he was invited to a wealthy man's house. And do you know he etched on his window? One thing thou lackest. The words of Jesus to the rich man. Now, that's bad manners, scratching that in somebody's window, don't you think? I believe it's still there to this day. Be a missionary disciple. Change your manners. Rock the boat. Be a missionary disciple. Experience the ecstasy. In verses 17 and 20, the disciples come back. Do you think that after facing the huge jobs and the dangers and experiencing being vilified by the people, do you think that they just came back like this? Despondent, dejected? No. They were filled with joy. They have experienced the thrill of treading on the serpent's head. They have received the mantle of Christ. They do what Christ did, but more, because there's 72 of them and there's only one incarnate Christ. The deeper we enter into the difficulties of discipleship, the deeper the joy. Why? Because we see God working supernaturally, and we enter into the glory of our heavenly calling. We see our purpose, and we see God. What more can we ask for in this life? Let me conclude with a story about a Lutheran scholar. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You may have heard of him. Anyways, he wrote this book called The Cost of Discipleship. It's a good one, even for Catholics to read. And in 1939, he was here in the U.S. He was teaching, pretty comfortable when the World War II broke out. He decided to take the last boat back to Germany, knowing that would cost his life. He wrote this in 1937, 2 years before this happened. As we embark upon discipleship, we surrender ourselves to Christ in union with his death. We give over our lives to death. Thus it begins. The cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Be a missionary disciple. It'll mess up your life for the better. For the better.